going to move this over here. So what we talked about to begin with were some of these theories that located the causes inside individuals, inside their brains, inside their genes, for example. All those individual approaches, or individualistic. Sociology have to offer? Well, as we saw, even with kind of state-of-the-art, cutting-edge knowledge about what the basis of criminality or the potentiality to criminality might be, right? The warrior gene stuff, and I hope we've begun to check out that video. I think you'll find it entertaining, that documentary. One thing you might, just as a side note before I go on here, critical eye documentary, understand that what they're trying to do is entertain you as much as inform you. And in the process, they may have sacrificed some precision, maybe even made claims that were stronger than they ought to have been made regarding our knowledge about the genetic bases. Like, it made the case that they simplified some of the causal pathway through which the genes can actually exercise an effect on how we behave. Anyway, that's just kind of a qualifying remark to make about that documentary. Anyway, about the research, right? These people that locate this NAOA gene, you got the good one that presumably keeps you, or sort of lowers the possibility of the kind of mental states, impulsivities that conduce to crime, okay? And then the shorter version, which is the suspect version, you get all that knowledge, and it still turns out that's not going to tell you everything, okay? It all depends on whether or not this genotype ends up in a kind of environment that seems to leave the genotype to express itself in a certain way, right? So it looks like sociology is still in business. There's work to be done there, okay? Sort of, that's the good news for the social sciences. So as sociology has been, for some time, about deviance and criminal deviance, okay? So this guy, Durkheim, a youth guy from France, came up with that theory of anomie about suicide rates based in economic factors. And he defined crime. He was the one who basically was the really abstract definition of crime where you can't look at the behaviors themselves, okay? You can't define deviance by just kind of listing out all the behaviors, murder, theft, and so on and so forth, okay, that people see as deviant, because from historical period to historical period, from place to place, our ideas about whether these things are criminal or not, deviant or not, bad or not, have changed, right? So you would think about witchcraft, for example. You could think about slavery, for example. You could think about a whole host of behaviors that have kind of cycled in and out of being regarded as criminal or not. Right? So it looks like what deviance is rests far more strongly on how people decide to categorize it. And that's his essential insight. So when he writes famously this quote here, in a society of saints, and so you might have in mind, like, nuns in a convent, for example, okay? In that kind of society, stuff we do on the outside, hold on, I'm sorry, it's stuff that they see as scandalous, behind the walls of a convent. Outside of that context, people might say, oh, that's nothing, right? So the behavior itself will change as any society it finds itself in. Now, Durkheim had some other ideas about crime personality that I want to draw here. Express them by taking a look at this famous case in history, ancient Athenian Greek society. There was a famous wise person, a philosopher, Socrates. Socrates was a controversial figure. He ended up being sentenced to death. He was basically, he did some stuff that Athenian society, elders in society didn't like. They told him to apologize for it, and he refused on principle. And they said, well, then, okay, we're going to sentence you to death. And it's kind of a famous death sentence. He was offered his choice of execution, and he chose to drink some poison called hemlock. So what was his crime? His crime was essentially teaching youth. He was a really popular figure. The young males, kids, really dug him. They thought he was, really interesting. He won their respect, largely for what we call today critical thinking. He asked them to question all this kind of fundamental beliefs that supported ancient Athens, ancient Athenian society. So like belief in the gods as being the cause of all the natural phenomena that people deal with, whether it be rain, droughts, illness, or what have you. You basically say the gods did it, right? The gods were angry. The gods meddled in human affairs and all that kind of stuff. And he asked people to question whether or not that's the best way of explaining this kind of stuff. He actually questioned forms of government that people assumed or didn't question. What else? I mean, that's enough for our purposes. He asked people to question the kinds of things that they'd always taken for granted as being the pillars of their society. And what happened, there was a kind of a coincidence in which Athenian society was suffering a kind of drop in their kind of international fame and success. They lost a big old war to a rival city-state called Sparta. I think that was the case. Or wait, it was the Peloponnesian War. The details of which, don't have to detain us, but people were looking for scapegoats, people to blame for this, and Socrates apparently, as the story goes, was one of those people. They said, that's why we're falling apart. That's why we can't keep our act together, get our act together. That's why we're crumbling, is because you're knocking down these pillars of ancient Athenian society. Belief in the gods, respect for the gods, sacrifices to the gods. I mean, those are crucial central elements of our society, and now you're asking people to question them. Or beliefs about, he was actually questioning whether or not democratic society as it existed in ancient Athens, and you might, just as an aside, recall that ancient Athens has served as one of the models for modern democracies. People look back to ancient Athenian society, how did they run that form of government? But he was raising questions about it, and this struck people as like, to use an expression, knocking down sacred cows. You don't do that, right? You don't do that because they thought it's dangerous. So when they put him to death, or what Durkheim does is he draws a couple lessons from this about deviance in general. Okay, he points out, it's interesting from our point of view, Durkheim's point of view, that Socrates for us wouldn't be seen as a counterproductive kind of person. He would be seen as somebody who's valuable, somebody who's teaching critical thinking, right? Question basic assumptions. And so this idea of critical thinking and its value as being the kind of thing you ought to do, right? To get into the habit of doing. I mean, it's that's what science is all about, is questioning, kind of received wisdom about how the world works, so you can clear up room in the mind for other kinds of, hypotheses that may prove to be true. Okay. And what Durkheim says is, interesting. So it looks like a deviant can kind of be an engine for innovation, here, innovative ways of thinking. So what's deviant yesterday might become sort of productively innovative in the future. Okay, so they can be a source of new ideas, people who think outside the box, and the ideas may be scoffed at or scorned originally, but may prove to have some some use that you wouldn't have anticipated. Okay, another function is this. More is Durkheim thought. Let me use this little tool here. I'm kind of I would consider myself a what's the word? A graphic thinker, is that the way to put it? There must be some other way. I think in terms of pictures very often. Is what deviance does is it allows us to draw a boundary between us and them. Right? And what they did with Socrates is they put him on stage. Everyone was aware of his trial. He was brought before the tribunal, and people would get up and make speeches scandalized by what Socrates was doing, corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and destroying its future, and so on and so forth. And people expressed their indignation very loudly and elegantly and so on. And what this did is it allowed people to redraw the line between those who affirmed and upheld the values central to their society and those who cross that line, like Socrates, and lay outside of that line. Okay? So, and Socrates, or Durkheim says this, he said, so that's, he argues, an essential function of any social formation, any social group, any collective us requires a boundary around it. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. Society doesn't exist unless there's a boundary, a circle surrounding it that distinguishes it from stuff that's not it. That's kind of the idea. So deviance and alerting people to deviance and punishing deviance has this boundary maintenance function, separating the us from them. Without it, you lose your identity. A community loses its integrity. It falls apart. It's not a community anymore. Okay, and then, so he suggested, Durkheim suggested there's probably some kind of minimum, or let me put it a different way, an optimum, not too much, but not too little, an optimum level of deviance that society requires to draw a line around itself, separating us from them. Too much deviance, and it's too costly for society, right? It causes that confusion about what's right and wrong and so on and so forth. Too little deviance, and the boundary between us and them gets crossed out or erased, and you lose your sense of who you are. I got to say, every time I put forward this idea, I feel like I'm trying to convince myself, because on the one hand, it seems really abstract, and I'm like, okay, there's ways of drawing lines between us and them. Does it require this kind of, labeling of deviance? Does it require the publicization and punishment of deviance, or can we do it some other way? Okay, I hope that part seemed clear. Now, this next thing here that I want you guys to recall, this is in your textbook, is this research that was done by a guy named Erikson. Okay. So that theory that I just told you guys about, it may strike you as interesting. It may strike you as plausible, right? And by the way, you can speak up if you want to. Like if you hearing that theory, you're like, I don't understand it, or you go like, I don't buy that, or you're like, yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, he's essentially saying, by the way, that, or he proposes that there's a tendency in society to produce new forms of deviance if old forms of deviance are going extinct. If our methods of social control are so effective that they're actually, discouraging or destroying traditional forms of deviance, and therefore we're going to lose this boundary maintenance function, then what society will do? Those that survive, they'll produce new forms of deviance. Okay, so he's basically giving us a kind of theory that suggests that forms of deviance go in, some fall out, and some kind of come in as time goes on. I don't know if anybody feels one way or another about that. Like if it seems like as soon as old forms of deviance get stamped out, suddenly you find new ones kind of cropping up and emerging. Well, this guy here, okay, his research tried to address that problem. Okay, he did research that he said was one of the first pieces of evidence that this idea was right, that supported this idea. Okay, and long story short, okay, I'm going to tell this as quickly as I can. He examined through historical documents, court records mostly, a Puritan settlement. It was basically the one on the East Coast, like Massachusetts, Boston, that area. Okay, the famous Puritans, a very puritanical society in which the form of government was partly theocratic. That is, like, religious principles drawn from scripture were incorporated into like the legal system and so on, right? And so it was very, very puritanical in the sense that all kinds of behaviors that we may not really even blink and raise an eyebrow at were literally prosecutable, right? They were illegal. You couldn't do them. So these Puritans, this Kai T. Erikson, here's what he notes. Okay, let me erase this so that I can use this tool again. What he notes is the following. There's a 50-year period, more or less 50-year period, over which this community, Puritan community, is racked by 3 waves of crime. One of them are people who are breaking the kind of laws of the land. They're religious heretics from the point of view of the Puritans. So the Puritans basically are saying, if you're going to live here, you're going to have to abide by our religious principles, and you're going to have to basically belong to our faith, our church. Okay, but also, like, there's certain things you couldn't do. So they were Calvinists, they were predestinatarians, and one of the things that it was disallowed to say is to say that you were confident or claim knowledge that you were saved, that you were elect, that God had chosen you, okay? Because you weren't supposed to have that kind of knowledge. So there was somebody who actually made a claim that you could know that through the way you felt, okay, through feeling your relationship to God, you felt confident. And they said you can't do that, okay? And so they went after people like that who outwardly, publicly violated these laws. Then there were the Quakers, who were non-Puritans, so actually professed another kind of set of beliefs. And the Puritans said, that's not cool. You can't do that. You can't be here if you're going to do that. And the Quakers dug in their heels and said, we're going to believe what we believe, and we're going to try to spread our word, and we're going to do it here. Okay. And so they were prosecuted, persecuted and prosecuted, brought to court, sentenced, given a fine, and sentenced. Okay. And then everyone pretty much is, I'm guessing people have heard of the Salem witchcraft trials. Okay. That's included as well. So people who either claimed or were accused of practicing the kind of black arts, right? You know, the draw on the powers of the devil and so on to create havoc in the community. So what T. Erikson did is he actually got the court records and he saw how many people were being brought to trial and convicted and sentenced. So he got, and he called that the deviance rate. Rate of convictions in court was the rate of deviance. And so he was able to get a kind of take on what the rate of deviance over time was over these 50 years. And here's what he found. What it looked like was the following. What you would have expected with these waves of crime is for there to be an uptick, and an uptick in the total conviction rates, right? Because you would be adding these new criminals to the kind of standard kinds of crimes that were normally being committed. You know, public drunkenness, fornication, this, that, and the other thing, right? Whatever people are normally brought in. But instead, that's not what he saw. Okay? What he saw is that the conviction rate remains stable throughout these three waves of crime. Now, that's the data. That's what he thinks he discovered. And then everything lies in the interpretation that he makes of that data. What significance does he draw from the fact that he does not see the expected sort of rises in total conviction rates? And it's the following. Okay, what he says is, he said this somehow supports Durkheim's theory that society requires an optimal level of deviance in order to draw the boundary between us and them to maintain community identity. Otherwise, you fall apart as a society. And so here's his reasoning was the following, that it has to be optimum. You can't have too much deviance or you pay some price for deviance. But what's interesting here is that because the deviance rate remains stable, so the stability of the deviance rate he takes as stability. The stability of the deviance rate is for him the evidence that there is this mechanism of a sort of production, put it this way, production of optimum deviance rate, deviance level. Let me say that one more time, okay? Since what he didn't find is that these crime waves gave rise to an uptick in criminality, instead you see the level of criminality being stable. The stability itself, he said, was indirect evidence that society was always keeping the deviance at the right level in order to draw the line between us and them in the Puritan society. Okay, that's his reasoning. And I can follow his reasoning as far as it goes, but I find it like really stretching. Like it seems like he really is kind of twisting the evidence around to fit the theory because he likes Durkheim's theory. Anyway, that's my own impression. You might find it convincing. You might find it reasonable. By the way, other people just one little thing you could have, well, what is going on? Why is the rate of convictions stable, if not for this reason? And you might say alternatively, well, it's simply, it's a capacity problem of the criminal justice system of the Puritans. The number of jails, how big the jails are, you know, the jailers and other enforcement personnel, the courts and so on, they can only process so many convictions at a time. And so what they end up doing is if suddenly they get a flood of like religious heretics coming into their courts, they start kind of, you know, a blind eye gets thrown at other kinds of crime because they know they can't deal with the numbers, right? So that's I mean, that would be an alternative, plausible, at least on the face of it, plausible explanation for the stability of the rates, right? And actually, quite frankly, I find that one, I don't know, more easier to believe. It's certainly less abstract than this explanation. He did point out, though, one thing about Puritan society is it could be that you could make a stronger argument pointing out that Puritan society at the time was experiencing all kinds of internal disputes and fragmentation. People were at each other's throats. People were just making land claims and disputes about land claim. Basically, the population was growing, but they were kind of hemmed in. They couldn't expand when they would have liked to expand because they were surrounded at all corners by kind of enemy population, indigenous groups, Native American groups. So there were tensions between European settlers and the indigenous groups, and so they were kind of land hungry. And this pressure on the population led to all kinds of bickering and infighting and so on. And so you could maybe make an argument that, oh yeah, I see, at a time when this community is suffering, sort of suffering in the way it is, becoming fragmented, that's when you see this kind of wave in crimes, new forms of deviance arise that I guess emphasize or re-emphasize the distinction between us. Okay, it pulls us together, it unifies us, you know, versus some them, religious Hicks, witches, Quakers, you name it. Okay, so that's Kai T. Erikson's theory or research used to support this sociological theory of criminality. Now, let me go ahead and erase that stuff up there. Any comments as I erase here and get ready to move on? Do you think there's anything to Durkheim's theory that if society starts running out of deviance, it'll just produce new deviance? That seem right to you guys? Okay. If no thoughts about that, what am I doing? All right, there we go. So I'm going to present this theory today called strain theory. Oh, sorry. I'm losing control over my PowerPoint. Okay, strain theory. This theory comes out of Durkheim, basically, and it's an extension of Durkheim's theory of anomie. Let me just remind you of that theory of anomie. So this guy Durkheim, he tried to explain why it is that a major source of suicide seemed to be like economic turmoil, and but not just economic losses, but even rapid economic gains. Okay, so he said that, and his explanation was this discrepancy between aspirations and the opportunities for realizing them. So he basically focused on, like, what people have. He used the word the collective consciousness. What kind of expectations for the good life, ideas about what it involves, what kind of house you're going to live in, how you should dress, what your family should be like, and so on and so forth. Collective consciousness provided people with those sets of aspirations. And then if the world kind of changes and comes to be out of step with those ideals, okay, there's this discrepancy between what you not want and what the world can give you. Okay, that can be suicidogenic. It can lead to or generate suicidal behavior. This guy named Robert K. Merton, who is a U.S. American sociologist, thought there was a lot of potentiality in this theory to explain a whole host of behaviors in the United States. And so he tried to update this theory and tailor it to the U.S. American scene of like the 1920s up through the 1930s. Merton developed this, and the 1920s, if you recall, maybe, or if you've heard, was a period of very rapid economic growth, and also the growth in wealth, principally in like financial assets, people making a killing from stocks and bonds, their values rising, and so on. So financial assets. Also growth in consumer culture, a period of time, during which, people are just buying more stuff, from clothes to gadgets to what have you. And what Durkheim said is that in this era in the United States, rapid industrialization, commercialization, financial success, economic growth, and so on, what's happening is that the kind of aspirations, large aspirations, big aspirations that Durkheim saw only among wealthy people in the urban centers, Merton said, because of modern mass media, the radio was coming online for the very first time, but other kinds of print that got widely circulated, especially in the realm of advertisement, so catalogs and other forms of advertisement. Because of that advertising industry, essentially, the same sets of dreams, goals, aspirations were being spread to everyone. Everyone was being exposed to something that he called the American success ideology. Let me draw this back. So Durkheim called the American success ideology was essentially the set of goals, dreams, and so on, models of what the good life looked like. And here's how he characterized American society in the 1930s, and you can ask yourself, has this changed? Does his description still fit what you see around you today? That is, has there been considerable continuity in the United States between Merton's day and our own? So he wrote that the American success ideology makes material standards the predominant ones for measuring your worth as an individual. When you gauge your life and you say, have I been successful or not? Have I made it or not? There's a pressure in US society to make the standard of evaluation of that success a financial one, having to do with what's your income? How much wealth do you have? your occupational prestige, and luxury goods. What kind of stuff do you have, right? What kind of home do you live in? What kind of car? How many kind of cars do you drive? And so on. All that kind of stuff, right? Consumer possessions, income, wealth, and all these other kinds of material economic measures are the principal way in which people judge how they're doing. Now, he's not saying that's the only one. He's not saying that's the exclusive one. There's other ways of judging your success. How kind of a person are you? Okay? How much do you help other people? It may have to do with maybe you're an artist, or maybe you have some kind of other set of goals in life, athletic, artistic, or whatever. They may not be financially rewarding, but actually you may be awesome at it and have other standards of evaluation. But what he's saying is that American society is one in which the pressure to evaluate yourself financially is greater than the other pressures, and very often wins over other kinds of criteria of self-evaluation. So that's what he calls the American success ideology. And we could use a simpler word called the American dream, right? The American dream is a kind of simple, concrete, material one. It has mostly to do with an image of the kind of stuff you're going to have and be surrounded in and live in and so on. Okay. So here's what he said. He said that this American success ideology, through the growing mass media of the day, ended up being spread to everyone, rich and poor, urban and rural. Everyone was bathed in this stuff because the mass media reached everywhere. So that's different from rural France of the 1800s, where if you lived as a peasant in some outlying province, you probably would never be exposed to the kinds of fashions and so on that, some upper echelon person in Paris was. Okay, so your aspirations would be different. Your exposure, okay, to models of the good life would be different. Here, Merton is saying that U.S. American society was different in the sense that the same kind of goals were spread to everyone. And what was the effect of that? Okay, the effect of that, he said, was that, so whereas anomie, discrepancy between what you want and what you need, that discrepancy was greatest or most common among wealthy people. Okay, because they could lose wealth or they could have become wealthy overnight, and that would make what they wanted versus, what the world give them, it could make that be a mismatch. Now, however, the people who most commonly, most frequently are going to suffer a mismatch between what they want and what they needed are people in the lower reaches of society, poor people, people with less means, right? Since they're wanting things in the catalogs, in the radio advertisements, in the late, in decades to come through television, they're going to want the same things as everyone else, despite what their actual conditions are. The composition of their community, their job opportunities, their present income, so on. Okay, and then here's what he said. Here's the model. Okay, how this actually works. What happens when there's a discrepancy between what you want and what you need? Merton speaks of a cultural goal. So the American success ideology, that's the cultural goal. That's the word he's using. Okay, this set of ideas about what you want. And then when those are combined with what your actual conditions are there obstacles? Yeah, I don't make much money, and I don't have many job opportunities in the particular area that I find myself in. So then it's as though this cultural goal, which creates all these wants and desires, kind of meets this obstacle. It's a dam. Think of it that way. But think of it as like these goals are like, deep waters of a river. coursing very strongly, right? And this dam is very thin, not sufficient to hold this stuff. And that's this pressure, this internal pressure that's going to somehow work itself out one way or another, okay? So Merton uses, instead of speaking directly about criminal behavior, illegal behavior, he avoids that kind of terminology in order to opt for what he considers a more neutral way of speaking. And he says what's happening here is you're finding alternative or so-called deviant means for reaching the same ends. What happens when people don't have enough money, the right job, et cetera, to sort of express or realize these goals, which are exerting such a strong pressure? Well, they resort to other alternative means, okay? Maybe they thieve, maybe they, embezzle, maybe they do some other kinds of illegal activities, okay? So now I'm gonna show you, and your book, by the way, presents, I think, what is an easier graph to follow. But this graph here presents what Merton calls, Merton calls it typology. That is a list of types. Types of what? Types of what he calls adaptations. They're basically behaviors. Okay, so let me run through these really quickly. Okay, there's 5 of them. First of all, conformity. Okay, so conformity, the cultural goal, the American success ideology, the American dream, if there's a plus sign, so you plug yourself into there. Okay, if this was applying to me, the plus sign would mean that I have that it's been sort of injected into my brain, and I want this stuff, right? I want to live the American dream. Like, this is a strong goal for me. And institutionalized means basically just means legal means. Could be a job. You got a good job that makes sufficient amount of money. It's a good salary. It could be, I don't know, you could be the beneficiary of a trust fund. You could have received some kind of gifts, inheritance. Whatever the case may be, as long as the source of your, essentially, financial resources, the source of your financial resources is legal, he calls those institutionalized means. The institutions of society say they're cool, they're all right. Okay, so you have the goal, you have the means, you live the American dream. He calls that conformity, right? Okay. I'm going to run through all of these and then maybe finish up with a quick little exercise. Rebellion. Rebellion, he uses this different symbol here. What does he mean by rebellion? He says plus and minus. He basically says that this is a case where people want to replace the American success ideology with something different. They imagine a different value system. They imagine thinking differently, living differently. They want to transform society. If society is a game, right, where you try to get to the end, reach your goal, like in Monopoly, right, then these guys, they want to change the rules of the game. They want to make it a different game altogether, right? So they want to transform society. And one of the examples that Merton had in mind in the 1920s and 1930s were people who called themselves communists and socialists. And people who called themselves by those names in the 1930s actually had a prominence in the United States that they don't today. There were actually political parties that had no small influence and success in certain segments of the population in the 1920s and the 1930s. Okay, that's also unimaginable today. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to overhaul the capitalist system. They wanted to come up with a new system of production, distribution, rewards, and so on and so forth. They wanted to change the rules of the game. Okay, well, so they would be rebels in that they would want to kind of create a new world, put it that way. Okay, so then we have these three remaining ones. Retreatism. What does this mean? Cultural goal. The negative sign basically means you've given up on the American dream. You're no longer attached to it because you don't think you're going to get it. Number of experiences in your life have told you, I wouldn't even bother anymore, okay? Because you're not going to get there. You're too poor, or you're too, some other things have happened in your life. And then the negative side, yeah, so you don't have the money, you don't have the job, you don't have, and so you just gave up. And so his examples would have been people who altered their mental state or consciousness through chemical substances, alcohol, or, you know, you fill in the blank, whatever the case may be, so that they literally leave the world, right? They kind of opt out. You might also think of like cases of people who talk about getting off the grid, heading into the wilderness and just living off the land, right? They're exiting society. So they're just getting out of the game altogether. That would be retreatism. Ritualism. Okay, ritualism would be you have given up on the American dream, at least as you originally imagined it. However, you still have a job. You still go to work every day. You still play by the rules every day, faithfully, without thinking that that's going to lead to you making enough money to live the American dream as you imagined it, okay? And why he calls it ritualism, I'm not sure it's the best name in the world. You could think of it, the sense of routine or habit, doing something ritually over and over again, and you gain a positive sense of yourself as a faithful abider by the rules. You play by the rules, and that gives you a sense of, a positive sense of self. Okay. And then finally, okay, and in a chapter on deviance, this is kind of the most important category, or the category that you focus your attention on, is innovation. Okay, so the deviant and the criminal deviant would fit within what he calls innovation. So you have the cultural goal. Just like everybody else, just like everyone who conforms, you want the same things out of life, okay? That is, according to the American success ideology, these materialistic dimensions of life, right? You want all the newest technologies, you want a nice car, you want to replace the car after just a couple years, and so on and so forth, right? But you don't have a legal financial resources for realizing that, so you opt for other means, given the strain that you're under, okay? And that's kind of the idea. The idea, or the assumption you have to keep in mind, is that this strain is very great, okay, is his argument. So I'm going to finish here by seeing if I can get you guys to do the following exercise, see what kind of responses I can get. Let's see if I can find it here. Where is it? Katie, do you still happen to be with us by any chance? Can't see ya.
Oh yeah, sorry. I don't know why it keeps turning my video off.
By the way, if you prefer to put the image off, you can. Don't worry about it. As long as you're still there, I just um, let's see here. So this thing here, if you guys see this, um, okay, what is it asking? Why don't I give you like just a second to look at, first of all, are you able to read this okay? The stuff down here? Okay. Um, 4 examples of behavior, of stuff going on, some kind of situation that's being presented here. And if you're going to do like an exercise applying Robert K. Merton's strain theory, can we apply it? Does he fit? Does he help us think about these cases of behavior? What you can do is you can go for any piece of behavior, you can put it up here and go, do I put a plus there or do I put a minus there? Do I say that this is a case of somebody trying to live out the American dream? Okay. And then I go over here and I go, and do we have a case of like, is this like, do we got legal stuff? Is this legal ways of going about it? Right? So if it's not, right, negative. So if it's plus and it's negative, if you go back to that, that would be innovation. Okay? You're trying to live out the American dream, but you're doing it illegally. Negative would be you've given up on the American dream, and I mean, it's not even a question of whether you don't have the job to do it. That's where, if you remember, all that, you're basically retreating from society. You're exiting. You're leaving. You're giving up. You're not even playing the game. Okay. This one here, plus plus. You got the dream and you got the money. Conformity. Okay. This one here, you've given up on the dream, but you're still going to work and getting a sense of, positive sense of yourself from your kind of faithfully playing by the rules of the game. That would be ritualism. And then this last one is you're actually trying to envision and live within an alternative world, a transformed world. You're trying to change the rules of the game. Okay? So why don't I'll give you just a second to look at these 4 pieces of behavior. By the way, this word, I'm not assuming embezzlement. What embezzlement means, if you haven't run across that word before, it's usually like white collar workers who find a way of taking a little money for themselves from their workplace.
And is that like stealing?
Something more sophisticated than actually just taking dollar bills out of the cash register. It might be something, I don't know, you're manipulating numbers or something else. But let me just give you a second to think about how you might categorize each of these. And by the way, you may differ. There may be more than one legitimate answer to these. Theft of bread by a starving person. Gang warfare among teenagers. And I know there's not lots of information there, so it's hard to fill in the picture. Large corporation dumps toxic waste in the And by the way, this is an issue which is actually a topical issue. That is an issue that is relevant to us. There's people who talk about so-called environmental justice or environmental inequality, in which you may find that certain pollution or toxic chemical producing factories tend to be located in low-income areas. or waste disposal is. So what about theft of bread by a starving person? Who wants to, Katie, how would you categorize that? Would that be?
I think I would probably say,
I don't know, I put you on the spot. And actually, anybody can weigh in if anybody wants to come offer whatever they thought.
I would either say retreatism, because they don't have the the means to get what they need. I think it would depend on the person. If they've given up, maybe they're trying to get back on their feet. So I think that really depends on the starving person per se.
I think you're right. I think we need more information about like how they're feeling, what their motivations are. I think you're right. And I think if we had that information, you might want to say retreatism. Like if you're not too worried about the theft of bread, like, I mean, come on, it's just bread. So probably it's not going to be anything worth more than $2 of theft, right? So retreatism, I bet some may have thought of themselves, well, is it innovation, right? It's illegal, right? But then you're kind of like, yeah, but you really say that the person is trying to live the American dream for getting bread? You might say indirectly, right? First they gotta eat or to have enough calories to reach the American, but it'd be kind of a hard case to make. Actually, I would say that this example is a hard example to work with in any case, right? Maybe this theory doesn't, work perfectly for all kinds of behaviors. Darius, did you think of anything for this second one here? Gang warfare, teenage gang warfare. Like what kind of category would that fit in? Ooh, I'm sorry.
Leaving. Yeah, I don't see them as actually like leaving society and leaving the American dream. But it's still something that's illegal.
Okay. So by the way, you were muted at first, so I didn't hear which category.
Oh, I think they're in the first category.
Okay, innovation, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could definitely see that, especially like, so you could say they're trying to live out the American dream if you fill in the blanks by just making money.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't say, it just says warfare. It doesn't say like they're fighting over like, I don't know, the best points of sale. They're trying to sell drugs to make money so that they can buy stuff with the money and live the American dream.
Yeah.
But we could maybe assume that. Yeah. Did you think of anything in particular for this one, second one? Or are there other examples that you came up with some kind of category for? Have any thoughts about? Where would you want to put this one?
I'd say that's innovation. I mean, yeah, innovation, because it's illegal, but they're trying to live the American dream.
I think so, yeah. To me, that's a really clear one. It's hard to imagine that if you're embezzling $100,000, I I mean, that's a fair chunk of change, right? That's a little bit of money. So probably you're going to want to buy some stuff with it. Could be that you have debts. You got in trouble and now you're in debt, but probably you're in debt because you wanted to get stuff, right? Yeah. So that seems pretty clear. This last one, look, this last one's kind of, I swipe these examples from elsewhere, so I didn't come up with them myself. So I guess this last one, I could see how it would fit with innovation. Usually what it is, it's a company that's trying to maximize its profits if it just dumps waste in violation of kind of environmental standards and puts a community at risk. I mean, if it's doing that, it's probably because it's cheaper for it to do so than processing the waste in properly. It usually costs a little more. So they're trying to maximize returns, and I guess where there's more money, usually that means you could make a case for innovation. And there's actually, it turns out, for a lot of these pieces of behavior, you can find ways in which they fit into more than one category, like the one up here, innovation retreatism. So there's kind of flexibility in dealing with this model. I wanted to just finish today by mentioning a weakness or two of the model, or criticisms of that model, and that'll set the stage for what we'll talk about next Tuesday. So one thing about string theory that people have pointed out is, for one, it's all about economics. Okay, it's all about economics, and it's actually it seems to simplify human psychology. So it's like this really simple mechanism, right? It simply says so I'm going to call it's a form of simple economic determinism. Given what your goals in life are, your material goals in life, it simply says that beyond some threshold of economic well-being, or below some threshold of economic well-being, you're going to experience this strain, and that's going to lead you to commit a crime. Right? So it's kind of like, input, output. Put in the amount of income given a certain set of goals, and it's going to produce strain, or it won't. And that does lead to a prediction. So here's the prediction. So it predicts that as the economy, the health of the overall society economy rises or falls, right? Jobs get produced, average income goes up, and so on. As the economy gets better, there's going to be less strain, and therefore less criminality, right? So as the economy gets better, crime goes down. Economy gets worse, crime goes up, and so on. So that there's this inverse relationship, okay, between the economy and crime. So look, then you would say, okay, what is our crime rate today compared to last year? Okay, oh, it's risen. Oh, that must mean our economy has, gotten worse. And so you can take a look and see if that works. So interestingly enough, we'll actually talk a little bit about that. That prediction, strain theory has, in certain periods of time, actually successfully predicted crime rates based on, economic indicators, but in other periods of time, not. Okay, so that's what we'll do next week. We'll look to some of the kinds of theories that have addressed or tried to compensate for strain theory's weaknesses, that it's kind of focused too much on economic factors and not on other kinds of factors, like the influence of peers, for example, okay? In on your thoughts, on your behaviors, and so on, and other kinds of things as well. So that pretty much covers it for today, guys. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for your input. So like I say, next week we'll continue on with the deviance. I don't know if we'll finish. I'll kind of make that call on Tuesday. It depends on how much of the stuff on the criminal justice system I wanna go into. But the way we finish up the semester is we finish up with talking about chapters 11 and 12 on inequality and social class. Okay, kind of other relevant topics as well. Okay, I'll also get your exams graded, or quiz 5 graded this week as well. And then just a reminder that I do want you to watch that documentary. I think you'll enjoy it. It's pleasurable enough to watch, I think. And so there's the discussion on that, and also the one homework is this real kind of simple completion exercise where you just track down the definitions of these deviance theories in your textbook and post those. Okay. All right then, guys. You guys got any questions? No? Okay, you're good to go? All right, well, thanks, and we'll see you guys next week then. Have a good weekend.
Have a good
Thank you.
weekend.